Is she?
Those actions are consistent with someone who is avoiding the thought of having been the perpetrator of the killing.
But is she thinking about the trauma? I'm not asking about it doesn't say killing there, right? Does it?
No.
In fact, it could be a car accident where nobody was killed, right?
Correct.
So trauma just indicates the event, whatever that event was, right?
That's right.
The other thing is that, didn't she also send some text messages over to him?
I believe so.
And these text messages were after the killing, right?
Yes.
She wasn't avoiding thinking about him when she sent those text messages, was she?
It was a method that is consistent with her behaving in a way that reduced the impact of the trauma on her, because by engaging in that alternative behavior, she was not having to get in touch with her feelings of responsibility for his demise.
She was trying to stage a scene, is what she told us.
Well, that's what she did. She didn't tell that to me.
It's characterized as her testimony.
Overruled.
Wouldn't that be inconsistent if that's what they're doing, staging a scene? Wouldn't that be inconsistent with avoiding thoughts? In fact, you're actually really thinking about the trauma then if you're trying to stage a scene, aren't you?
Well, that was not told to me.
Well, let's assume then that that's what she said, that she was trying to stage the scene. Wouldn't that indicate that just the opposite?
Not necessarily.
Objection, Judge. May we approach?
You may. Sustaining the last objection, the jury is directed to disregard the last question and answer. You may continue.
Sir, with regard to avoiding responsibility, isn't the idea, if somebody wants to avoid responsibility involving the trauma, actually the antithesis of what you have here?
No.
Avoiding responsibility on something, isn't that saying something that you are thinking about the trauma, but you just don't want to be held responsible?
It doesn't say responsibility. The criteria do not say responsibility.
It does say efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, right?
Yes.
And if someone's thinking about their responsibility, isn't that contrary to avoiding thoughts associated with the trauma?
Yes. There's a difference, however, between the trauma of observing someone being killed and recognizing that you killed the individual.
And I understand that you keep saying that, but the DSM-4 doesn't say that, does it?
The definition of trauma is not contained within that particular criteria.
I understand that now you're trying to be a wordsmith involving trauma, but
Characterization.
Sustained.
with regard to the word trauma, are you saying that the word trauma means specifically that it has to apply to somebody who killed somebody unlawfully? Is that what you're saying?
No, of course not.
Right. It can be lawful or unlawful, right?
Correct.
Just as in the example that you gave in Afghanistan where a soldier killed somebody, right?
Correct.
That's a lawful killing, right?
Yes.
As opposed to another killing outside of this courtroom where somebody takes a gun and shoots somebody, right?
That's right.
And so trauma applies to both of them, doesn't it?
It does, but there's a different essence to each of those traumas. People react emotionally differently to those types of traumas.
They may react emotionally differently, but anybody who is diagnosed with PTSD has to walk through these portals here in DSM-4, don't they?
Yes, absolutely.
And did you ever work for the military?
Not extensively, no.
Well, do you have any information about how the military does its thing with regard to diagnosing somebody with PTSD?
Objection, beyond the scope.
Approach. You may continue.
Doesn't the military, when they, if you know, when they diagnose somebody with PTSD, don't they follow the criteria in the DSM-4?
Yes.
Same thing with a police officer that you talked about, maybe in the Times article that you talked about. If that officer was found to have been diagnosed with PTSD, he would have, by necessity, have been diagnosed pursuant to DSM-4, correct?
Right. I don't believe the officer was diagnosed with PTSD, however.
But assuming that he had. Or
Yes.
you said that you've worked with police officers
Yes,
before,
the same
right?
criteria would apply.
So one of the other things that you talked about was this email or this instant messaging involving the defendant and Mr. Alexander, where he called her 3 salacious names. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you also remember the other part of that conversation where Mr. Alexander was upset and he told her...
Objection, Judge. Maybe approach.
do you remember saying that you reviewed a conversation where the victim, Mr. Alexander, called the defendant certain names? Do you remember that?
I
when
do recall that, yes.
And it was Miss Wilmot that asked you that, right? Do you
Yes.
remember that? And you were able to tell us that you had actually reviewed that, right?
Yes.
But as part of that same conversation, isn't it true that Mr. Alexander was upset and said, do you remember reading that he was nothing more than a dildo with a heartbeat to Miss Arias? Do you remember reading that part?
I did.
So that's part of the same conversation, isn't it?
Well, I believe it occurred in the same time frame.
No, not the same time frame. Do you want to take a look at it and see, to refresh your recollection to see?
Yes,
what
that would be helpful.
This is Exhibit 275. Go ahead and take your time and read it. This is that, and then the other ones are.
Okay.
I want you to review the whole thing to see if it includes those words previously also. That were
The
used.
other
Or
words?
Or do you just recognize it by looking at it?
No, I read the part that you had
Go ahead
referred
and
me
take a
to.
look at it and find the other section.
Okay.
You may want to start at the beginning.
And what is it specifically you're asking me to find?
I'm just asking you to read it to see if it's the same conversation where he used those three names so that
Okay.
we can follow up.
Okay, I did come across the three-hole wonder.
Don't, just read it. Did I ask you to tell me? Just read it, okay?
The
Once
whole
you're
thing?
done reading,
Okay.
let me know.
All right, I didn't want to take up the first time.
Alexander Pierce, would you say it comes, the way you were reading it from this way forward, that it comes after he makes the derogatory comments about her?
I think it came after.
Well, why don't you take a look, okay? This thing about, so his comments about her came after the derogatory comment about himself being a...
Objection, Judge. These are out of sequence. We just discussed.
Approach, please.
And so these statements were made as a part of the same conversations, weren't they?
Yes.
In fact, he's complaining to her about her taking advantage of him sexually, right?
Objection. Beyond the scope, relevance.
Overruled.
Right?
Yes.
And, sir, does the date of this conversation, the one that you reviewed prior to coming to court, did it have a date on it?
I'm sure that it did, but I don't remember the date.
Was the date important to you?
Well, the relative time frame was important, yes.
And the one that you read did have a date and time, right?
I believe it did.
Take a look at Exhibit 275 to see if that, it may or may not refresh your recollection as to the date and time of this conversation.
$526.08.
Well, without saying it, did it refresh your recollection or not?
Honestly, no.
Okay, then that's fine.
Doesn't remember, doesn't remember.
Okay. One of the things that you talked to us about in response to a juror question was this fight or flight syndrome. Do you remember
Yes.
talking about that? And one of the things that you said was that, and you analogized it to animals. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
That the first thing that happens is there's this flight, correct?
There's an impulse to flee.
Right, and that's the first thing, in your opinion, that happens, right?
As a rule, yes.
And then if the animal can't get away, cornered, so to speak, then there's this instinct to fight, right?
Yes.
And this fighting is instinctual, is what you said, correct?
Yes.
And however, with animals, as soon as the fight is over, the vanquished is gone, then that ends the encounter, doesn't it?
Yes.
The winner, if you will, of this battle, whatever it was, doesn't then stick around and do other things with regard to the other animal that it's vanquished, does it?
Overruled.
Typically not.
Typically no means they just go about their business after that, right?
After recouping from their wounds, yes.
If they have any wounds, right? They may not have any wounds, right?
That's possible too.
So what they do is they're done, they move, and they go away, right?
Yes.
And they don't stick around, nosing around to try to take advantage of the dead carcass or anything like that, right?
Well, some animals kill for food.
Right.
And so
No,
they would consume the carcass.
But that's not the situation that we have here. According to you, we have a situation where there's an attacker, right? And then the other animal flees first, right? According to what you explained to us, right?
In that hypothetical,
Right,
yes.
that's what we were talking about. In that hypothetical, once the winner is determined, let's assume by death, they don't stick around, do they?
No.
They take off, right?
Yes.
Could it be, sir, that in this particular case, with regard to everything that we've seen, for example, your finding of PTSD, some of your findings of the elements and your scoring of the PDS and your Milan test, could it be, sir, that you looked at those results and because of the fact that it appears you're not objective anymore, that perhaps that could have colored the way you viewed your conversations and your results under the PTSD?
What could have colored my opinion?
Didn't you tell us that you had compassion for the defendant?
We're trained in empathy. Psychologists are trained in empathy. That is, the capacity to get into the minds and feelings of the client, to assist them, and to help understand when you do an evaluation. It is not necessarily compassion, even though Webster may say that. It is certainly not sympathy. And we are very, very carefully trained not to allow our empathic listening to lead us into any kind of over-identification with the client. That is what psychologists are trained for, sir. We are trained to be neutral observers of either an evaluation situation or when doing psychotherapy in a psychotherapeutic situation. We are trained not to over-identify with the client. It's crucial training.
Do you remember in a response to a question and follow-up by the defense counsel that you said that you had compassion?
I have been accused of being a compassionate person.
And sir, didn't you also say when you and I were talking about it that you felt sorry, at least during that first interview with the defendant?
No, I didn't say I felt sorry.
Did you use the word sorry in connection with the first interview with the defendant?
I don't remember saying that.
Do you remember that you used the word sorry when we were discussing the Webster's definition?
Well, we were talking about semantics at that point, so I may have, but that's not the context in which you're using it now.
Is that yes or no? Do you remember using the word sorry?
I don't remember using the word sorry.
And with regard to the word compassion, do you remember that you were the one that introduced it into this conversation?
That's right.
And isn't it true, sir, that this, to use your word, compassion, entered into your evaluation in this case?
No, what I said was that I have been accused of being a compassionate person. Empathy factored into this evaluation, as it would with any person I work with, because we are trained to be empathic listeners, but we are also trained to remain completely objective in doing our work, whether it's psychotherapeutic or evaluative.
And you're saying that you were trained to have this empathy, right?
I don't think that people are trained as much as a tendency to be an empathic person is brought out and then reinforced and modified by our training.
You were saying, though, just now, that you were trained to have empathy for the person that you are assessing, right? Isn't that what you just said?
We are trained to become empathic listeners.
Empathic listeners means you have empathy, correct? While
That's
listening.
right. We use empathy as a tool for evaluative purposes and for therapeutic purposes.
And in terms of this empathy or this compassion, whatever word you want to use, this is part of your training, right?
Yes.
Isn't good record keeping, for example, such as detailing what it was that you found with regard to PTSD and writing it out, isn't that something that's also, for example, exhibit number 544? Isn't it also part of training that you're accurate as to the subsections that you're finding and when you write them out? Isn't there some training for that?
Well, absolutely.
And isn't there some training that indicates that that being accurate is one of the things that's sacrosanct in this business?
Yes, I omitted a few letters and
So-
numbers, and the rest of my report, had it been read, maybe I'm sure you read it, is filled with accuracy.
I'm saying, though, isn't that part of your training? right?
Yes.
Isn't it also part of your training in the PDS that you need to score it effectively or accurately, right?
Accurately, I did score it accurately for the portions of the test that were pertinent to my use of the test.
I understand, but you came up with 3 different numbers. You came up with 15, 16, and 17, correct?
Those numbers didn't matter because I did not use that data, and it had nothing to do with the use of the PDS test as a confirmation for my diagnosis.
Yes or no? 15, 16, and 17 are 3 different numbers.
They are 3 different numbers. Yes.
And you are taught to be very accurate with regard to the results in these tests, right?
And if the results were critical, they would have been checked several times.
Sir, isn't it true that you are trained to be accurate in your results?
Yes.
sir. So that you've been telling us with regard to this issue involving the defendant and that you had received all this training about having empathy, compassion, but not letting it affect you, right?
Yes.
And you've also been telling us about the training and how the training is with regard to recording and how you attempted to follow that, and in your 35 years you had training in how to keep reports and records straight, right?
Yes.
You weren't successful with the records and the reports, were you? You weren't accurate.
A typographical error is not equivalent to being a neutral, empathic listener.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking, although you had training, you still failed in being accurate. We're looking at exhibit number 544. You weren't accurate there.
I admit a mistake was
True.
made in typing.
And just like you've had your 35 years of training, you made a mistake. Just like you had your 35 years of being compassionate and empathic, isn't it true that in this case, you lost your objectivity?
Objection.
Absolutely not.
Overruled.
Absolutely not.
I don't have anything else.
All right, looks like we have one additional juror question. Are there any other questions from the jury? Counsel, please approach. Wilmot.
Dr. Samuels, you were just asked by the state about the conversation that occurs by instant message that you were just reviewed.
Yes.
And you were asked about whether or not you remembered the statement that Travis or Mr. Alexander felt like he was a dildo with a heartbeat, right?
Yes.
You have also, in review of this case, you've listened to an audio tape of basically a sex tape, right?
Yes.
Where they're having phone sex.
Yes.
And during that conversation where Mr. Alexander is talking about what he wants from Miss Arias and talking about his particular sexual desires, anywhere on that tape does it appear that he feels like he's being used?
No.
Anywhere on that tape does it appear that he didn't want to have any conversations like phone sex like that?
No.
Did he ever appear unwilling?
No.
You were asked questions about avoiding the trauma and avoiding the trauma of killing Travis
Yes.
just a few minutes ago. If she's avoiding the trauma, that means does that mean avoiding thinking about what actually happened?
She's doing anything in her power to avoid reacting emotionally to what has happened.
So in doing so, if she has a conversation with Leslie Jodi about something that can never happen, like Travis's children playing with Jodi's children someday down the road, is that avoidance or is that thinking about the trauma?
It's not thinking about the trauma. It's more like avoidance of the trauma.
And why is it more like avoidance?
Because it's dealing with an unreality. It's not dealing with the fact that I killed Mr. Alexander. It's a way of putting an obstacle between what's going on in her life at the moment and the reality of what happened.
And in going to the memorial and paying her respects at the memorial, is that a way of avoiding what actually happened?
Absolutely. It's living in a fantasy world.
And when she journals after June 4th, and she journals about nice things about Mr. Alexander, trying to remember him in a nice way, is that avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
Yes.
And when she calls him and leaves a voicemail, she's not talking on the voicemail about what just happened, right?
Correct.
Sustained.
Is she talking about on the voicemail what just happened?
No.
No, and is she, in fact, talking about things that didn't happen?
Correct.
And is that avoiding the reality of what she did on June 4th?
Yes, in my opinion.
Same thing with her email.
The same thing with my email and my professional opinion, yes.
And in sending flowers to Travis's grandmother, again, like showing respects at the memorial, is that something that is avoiding what actually happened on June 4th?
It's avoiding coming to terms with what she was responsible for on June 4th.
Okay. You were asked questions about her being suicidal,
Yes.
and with regard to her journal writing, did she express bouts of depression?
Yes, she did. She suffered from bouts of depression.
All right. And to your knowledge, was there ever any type of intervention or anything needed during her high school because of any type of suicidal thoughts?
To my knowledge, there was never an actual suicidal attempt.
All right. And once you spoke to her after June 4th of 2008, what was her ideation about suicide at that point?
Well, she didn't have a specific plan, but she said it was part of her plan not to live long enough to go to trial.
And if she were to have written letters to her family members saying goodbye, and have written a letter where she drew a tombstone and wrote what she wanted to say, is that further evidence that she's actually thinking about suicide?
Yes.
Sustained.
It was, may we approach?